We were poor, but my mother went into debt to buy the World Book Encyclopedia so we would have a portal to see a larger world, believing things could get better. I am the heir of a tradition of faithful people who would put on their Sunday best and go to a bridge or go to a place where they knew they were going to be battered and bloodied and bruised by people who would not accept racial equality. And yet they went anyway.
This is CIA, Contagious Influencers of America. I'm David Sands.
And I'm Victoria Robinson. We have got a great show for you today. I mean, we're talking to a guy that is literally an American hero.
We're talking about Bryan Stevenson. Now, Bryan is a clinical professor at New York's University School of Law.
And he's also the founder and executive director of the organization Equal Justice Initiative.
He's an American lawyer, social justice activist, and author. He is the author of the best-selling book, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, which tells the story of Walter McMillan, played by Jamie Foxx in the film Just Mercy.
Exactly. And if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend that you do.
The movie was in theaters a while back. It should be streaming about now. You're going to learn from Bryan a couple of things in this interview that it drove me crazy to learn. Number one, through his efforts and the efforts of his team, they have essentially saved the lives of 135 people that were on death row.
Who were innocent.
And they got off. Okay? Not just they were innocent and they found out after the fact.
Right.
They got these people off because they proved that they were innocent in the first place. And here's another crazy statistic. 1 out of 25 people who happen to be on death row right now, they are innocent.
Do you understand what we're saying here? We're saying that people on death row are dying who are innocent. You know, everybody says, oh, well, they always say, I didn't do it. I'm here and I'm innocent. Well, guess what? Some of these people are innocent.
So Bryan's going to talk to us about why there's so much injustice in the U.S. judicial system in 2020. I mean, this is not 1870.
Here's the interview David did with Bryan Stevenson. You don't want to miss it.
What inspires you to do what you do?
You know, I just believe that we are called to do justice. You know, when I would hear the preacher preach out of Micah, and the question would be posed, what does God require of us? The answer would come back, we have to love mercy, we have to do justice, we have to walk humbly with God. And for me, this question of how to do justice has been present. You know, I grew up in a community where people were treated unjustly. I started my education in a colored school, and lawyers had to come in to make them open up the public schools to poor black kids like me. My dad couldn't go to high school when he was a teenager because of segregation, and it created a hunger to end justice. And I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, and I've always believed things I haven't seen. That's what faith is about for me. And when I went to Harvard Law School, I'd never met a lawyer before, but I believed I could be one. And I just feel grateful for this hope, this vision. I went to death row and met people who were literally dying for legal assistance, and some had been so unfairly treated that it kind of awoke something in me. I write in my book about how I actually heard a condemned man sing the hymn Higher Ground, my first visit. And when he started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Something changed in me. That's when I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But I also knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his. And I tell people all the time, if I've had any impact as a lawyer, if I've done anything during my career over the last 35 years representing the poor and the accused, it's because I got close enough to the condemned and the disfavored to hear them singing about higher ground. And that's what I think faith can do for you. It can actually lead you into places you don't expect to go. But when you get there, you find something powerful, something energizing, something restorative. And even though this work is challenging, I feel so privileged. I feel so blessed to get to do what I do, to stand with the poor and the accused and the abused and the condemned, and to fight for their humanity, to fight for their opportunity for redemption and restoration, for me has been a great privilege.
Why is there so much excessive and unfair sentencing in the United States?
Yeah. Well, we, I think, have allowed ourselves to be governed by the politics of fear and anger. And I think when you allow yourself to be shaped by fear and anger, you tolerate things you should never tolerate. You accept things you should never accept. In the 1970s and 80s, our politicians said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. And we're going to use the criminal justice system to respond to that problem. Now, we could have said that people who have addiction and dependency problems have a healthcare need. And we need the healthcare system to respond to that. But because we had people who were politicking through fear and anger, we didn't have space for that. And we used that rhetoric to create an environment where everybody wanted to be tough on crime. There was no forgiveness. There was no talk of mercy. There was no talk of rehabilitation, no talk of restoration. And in too many places, the church didn't intervene. And our collective silence created spaces that were all about retribution, that were all about revenge, that were all about punishment and harshness. And now we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Now we have hundreds of people who've been condemned to execution. Now we have children prosecuted as adults. We actually have 13 states in America that have no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. I represent 13-year-old kids who've been sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. And the absence of mercy and the absence of any concern about redemption is everywhere in our scheme. And so changing that has been, I think, the challenge that we've had to meet. And we've made some progress. It's depoliticized a little bit now. I think people from both parties recognize that we have too many people in jails and prisons. But we have a lot of work to do to recover from this era of extreme punishment, of over-incarceration, of not caring about the fact that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I've always believed that. That's what the Gospels teach me. I don't think if someone tells a lie, they're just a liar. I don't think if they take something, they're just a thief. I don't even think if you kill somebody, you're just a killer. And we kind of forgot that in this country. And we started reducing people to their crimes. And we don't put crimes in prison, we put people in prison. And if we don't understand who those people are, we're going to do things that are extreme and excessive and abusive. We still also have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And that's why so many people end up being convicted for crimes they didn't commit. And now we have thousands of innocent people in our jails and prisons. And so we're going to have to do some work to recover, to repair, to restore the kind of mercy, the kind of justice that I think many of us believe in.
You and your staff have won reversals, relief or release from prison for somewhat 135 wrongfully convicted folks, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these have been on death row?
Yes, those are the death row numbers. We've actually, won relief for hundreds of more people who were not on death row. But it speaks to the level of error that we have in our system. We have a statistic at the end of the film where we acknowledge that for every 9 people we've executed in this country, we've now identified one innocent person on death row. It's a shocking rate of error. And in any other area of public safety or public administration or public health, we would stop things. If somebody said, for every 9 apples in the store, if you touch one, you'll die, we wouldn't sell apples. But we continue to tolerate this risk of error in the administration of the death penalty because, again, that narrative of fear and anger is out there. And I get, we have people who commit terrible crimes. I hate violence. I'm going to do something to reduce violence. I think we have too much gun violence. We have too much gang violence. We have too much domestic violence. We have too much sexual violence. And so I'm completely aligned with doing what we can to end that. But I don't think that we can get there by just threatening and menacing people. And that's why I don't really believe that we should have the death penalty. I think the threshold question of capital punishment isn't do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? I think the threshold question is, do we deserve to kill? And do we deserve to kill if we have a system compromised by bias against the poor, biased against people of color, compromised by people who are not being held accountable for abuse and misconduct, compromised by politics? And I would just love to see the hundreds of millions of dollars we are spending on these extreme punishments to be redirected in services for victims and family members who lose loved ones to violence, and reinvested in helping communities get healthy so that we don't have this criminality in the first place.
So if you were given the opportunity to reinvent the system, so to speak, what would be the first thing you'd do?
I would commit us to restoration, to rehabilitation. I would use the principles that have shaped me of recovery and redemption. I would want people to be compelled to acknowledge a wrongdoing, but then to work with them to get to a better place. And I think for a lot of what we'd have to do, we'd have to kind of introduce a health frame. I think we should end this misguided war on drugs and begin to engage people with addiction and dependency with a healthcare response. We have a lot of mentally ill people in our jails and prisons, about 600,000. And we enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act in the private sector and the public sector. But the one place where we don't enforce it is the justice sector, because judges who have to impose mandatory sentences can't consider someone's disability when imposing that sentence. There are schemes in Europe, in Northern Europe in particular, where the orientation is very different. It's all about rehabilitation. It's all about recovery. It's all about restoration. And they have dramatically lower recidivism rates than we have in this country. That's the other scary thing, is that we're not very effective at preventing crime, of improving public safety, because we send people to places where they're abused, they're mistreated, they're overcrowded, there's no education, there's no care, there's no counseling, there's no services. And so people get out, and they're just as primed to offend as they were before. And I just think that has to change. We went from about $6 billion in spending in 1980 on jails and prisons to $86 billion last year. If we could invest half of that money into healthier communities, into education, into basic services, to helping kids who've been traumatized by abuse and violence, to helping faith communities actually do their work in spaces where people are looking for hope and faith, I think we could dramatically improve public safety in this country and dramatically lower the prison population that continues to rank highest in the world. That's what I would do. I would really try to begin talking about redemption, talking about grace, talking about mercy, talking about restoration, talking about accountability, but understanding that accountability comes when we actually recognize the full humanity of people, not just the parts that we're mad at. And I don't think we've gotten there in this system.
So it sounds to me like our prisons have become somewhat of a dumping ground for those with mental illness.
They have. They really have. I mean, I represent people all the time who are poor and who have a psychotic disorder. And what happens is, if they're in the middle of a psychosis on the street, someone will call the police. And because they're psychotic, when the police show up, they're not going to cooperate. They're going to resist arrest. And they're probably going to end up being charged with assaulting that police officer. They'll get taken to jail, they'll be tried, they'll be convicted, and the judge won't be able to consider the fact that they were psychotic. They won't be able to consider their disability, because we have these mandatory sentencing laws that require that person go to prison for 20 years or 30 years. And then they won't get treatment when they're in our state prisons or our city jails. And, the wardens and the custodians of these facilities, they don't want mentally ill people who they can't care for in their spaces, but that's where we send them. And that disconnect has given rise to some really tragic circumstances. We have an unbelievably high suicide rate in jails and prisons. We have an incredibly high distress rate through every metric. And it's one of the reasons why we have to do better in helping those who are disabled and mentally ill in our communities.
Up against all these odds, all these obstacles, what has kept you inspired, and what role has your personal faith played?
Yeah, well, it's been central to everything I do. I've always believed that you have to be willing to believe things you haven't seen. That's my tradition. That's my faith. My great-grandparents were enslaved. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia, but he learned to read as an enslaved child just because he believed one day freedom would come. And everybody would say to him, no, freedom's coming for you. And because he knew how to read, when emancipation came, he played a role in his community. All of the formerly enslaved would come to his house every night, and he would stand up and he would read the newspaper. And my grandmother would tell me about how powerful it was to see that house get quiet, filled with people, and to listen to him read. And she wanted that power. And so he taught her to read. And she was amazingly literate, even though she didn't have formal education. And she gave that to my mom. And my mom gave that to me. We were poor. We lived in a racially segregated community, but my mother went into debt to buy the World Book Encyclopedia so we would have a portal to see a larger world. That was about faith. That was about believing things could get better. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a place where believers have done extraordinary things. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. 60 years ago, people trying to do what I'm trying to do would frequently have to say, my head is bloodied but not bowed. I am the heir of a tradition of faithful people who would put on their Sunday best and go to a bridge or go to a place where they knew they were going to be battered and bloodied and bruised by people who would not accept racial equality. And yet they went anyway. And that compels me. That sustains me. That lifts me up. And for me, faith is about kind of turning what we believe into action. And if I believe that every valley shall be exalted, if I believe that the high places can be made low and the crooked places can be made straight, if I believe those rough places can be made plain, I have to believe that we can do better than having the highest rate of incarceration in the world. I have to believe we can do better than presume people are dangerous and guilty because of their color. I have to believe we can do better than lock everybody up and throw away the key. And that's what motivates me. That's what sustains me. My church, I used to play. Grew up playing as a musician in the church, and I played for testimonial services, and people would give their testimonies. And at the end of the testimony, no matter how difficult and challenging, we'd always break out in this song. They'd start singing, "Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now." And that's the way I feel. And it's so gratifying to be in this place with a film coming out and these amazingly talented people contributing to this effort of creating a consciousness about what we have to do.
And finally, I just want to ask you, what do you want to be remembered for?
Yeah. I just want to be remembered as somebody who tried to do what we are called to do. Jesus talks about the prevalence of condemnation, about our instinct to not forgive, to throw people away. And I love the scripture where when all of those who were gathered to stone to death, the woman who was caught in adultery, he doesn't doubt her guilt. He accepts her guilt. And yet he has this compassion. He has this vision. And he says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And that humbled people, that convicted people, and they walked away. I feel like today, that scripture is still true. That's still our teaching. And yet people are picking up stones and they're throwing them at the poor. They're throwing them at the vulnerable. They're throwing them at those who've been marginalized, those who are disfavored. And I feel like those of us who still believe in that teaching, who still understand the power of grace, we have to stand in front. We have to catch some of those stones. And I'd love to be remembered as a stone catcher. I'd love to be remembered as somebody who, tried to do the right thing, even when it was the hard thing, because that's ultimately how we create justice. It's actually how we change the world.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It's been wonderful, and congratulations on your new film and your story.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, Victoria, man, I think that President Trump ought to put Bryan in charge of reinventing our legal system and making real change, don't you?
I 100% agree. This guy is not only inspirational, David, and knowledgeable, he is literally saving lives. And you know how I feel about saving lives. I work in a different arena, the pro-life arena, but this guy is saving people from a death they did not earn and that they don't deserve.
Well, I thought it was amazing as I was sitting across from him how I could pose a question to him, and the guy was just full of solutions. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was so convincing. I didn't have to think twice. I'm like, wow, why don't we put this guy in charge?
Yeah, he is truly leaving a legacy.
So if you've not seen the movie Just Mercy, please do so. It is well worth your time. I'm David Sams, and you've been listening to Contagious Influencers of America, the podcast from the producers of Keep the Faith.
Hey, and I'm Victoria Robinson. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram, or go to KeepTheFaith.com.
If you enjoy the podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or to Spotify and subscribe, rate, and review Contagious Influencers of America.
Hey, be sure to join us next week. And of course, as always, thanks for listening.
And go out there and live that life in living color, because it sure is a heck of a lot more interesting than living it in black and white. See you next time.